Oh, hello. My name is Mara, and welcome to Books Like Woe. So we are rolling along in Project Poirot. Again, I mentioned this in the last video that I filmed on this day, but just so you know, my lighting is weird and my sound is weird. So I'm sorry about that, but that's just how things go. So anyway, today we are talking about 1-2 Buckle My Shoe here in Project Poirot, also known as the Patriotic Murders, I believe, but here in the US it is definitely called 1-2 Buckle My Shoe. And this is one that I think I actually read pretty early on in my journey with Agatha Christie, and I remembered that I liked it, and it was pleasant to me to remember why I liked it so much. But we will get into that in a minute. If you've never seen one of these Project Poirot videos before, just to give you some context, I do not do spoilers. I will take you up in a plot synopsis to roundabout when we find a body, and I will also get into some character details. So if you consider either of these things to be spoilers, feel warned. I do not consider that to be spoilery. So yeah, just, fair warning before we get into a plot synopsis. So 1-2 Buckle My Shoe, and I should just mention that that title is an allusion to the nursery rhyme that I think is, known throughout the English-speaking world, which is 1-2 Buckle My Shoe, 3-4 Close the Door, 5-6 Pick Up Sticks, all that stuff. And the plot finds ways to connect with each of the couplets as things go along in the story in a way that is somewhat contrived, but it's Agatha, so we'll let her have this one because she loves, oh my god, does she love a nursery rhyme or like a saying or a song. She loves doing her plots based off that. But anyway, so 1-2 Buckle My Shoe takes place, it starts off anyway, in a dentist's office, which is kind of a mundane way for something to start. But Hercule Poirot is going to the dentist for his biannual visit, and he goes to a Mr. Morley, not a Dr. Morley, a Mr. Morley. And Mr. Morley is a very I think kind of like well-known dentist based on some of his clientele, and he has an office that's like out of his house. So the first 2 floors are a dentist office, and he has another dentist who's in partnership with him, and then the top 2 floors are his personal residence. So Hercule Poirot is there to get his teeth cleaned, and there's a number of other patients who are in the waiting area, so he's sort of chatting with them or observing them at the initial start of the book. And then he basically, he goes home, no big deal. And then sometime later, Inspector Japp, who we have, I think, last saw in Death in the Clouds, or maybe in The Murder on the Mews. I can't remember if he was in that one. But anyway, we've seen him a while ago. But he shows back up at Hercule Poirot's apartment and says, hey, I just was called to the scene of somebody who committed suicide, and I was looking in his appointment log, and you just had your teeth cleaned by him, so I thought I would kind of check in with you about that. So basically the dentist is found dead of an apparent suicide, and they're trying to figure out why he might have committed suicide, because he didn't have anything that was troubling him. He definitely wasn't the type for suicide, and so they're trying to figure out why he might have done that. And then very shortly thereafter, the last patient he saw, who is Mr. Embryotis, is also found dead of an apparent overdose from the medication that Mr. Morley was giving him. So the official explanation is, oh, he killed himself because he realized after Mr. Embryotis left, accidentally gave him an overdose, and this was going to ruin him, so he killed himself. So that's sort of the official explanation for a long time, but Poirot is just not that satisfied with that explanation. And subsequently, there's also a female patient who was just at the dentist at that same time who also goes missing, and her name is Mabel Sainsbury Seal, which I feel like Sainsbury Seal is maybe the most British last name I've ever heard in my entire life, so props to you, Agatha, on that. But anyway, so she also goes missing, and from there is the whole unraveling of the case. So that's sort of the setup, and then getting into some of the characters. I mentioned the dentist, I mentioned some of the patients. A few of the other patients who were there that day is a Mr. Rakes, Howard Rakes, who is a young American agitator, basically. The other thing, the part that makes Poirot suspicious, is that one of the other patients who was there around that time was Alistair Blunt, who is essentially a major financier of the UK at this point, and is very, we'll get into it here in a minute, but he's considered to be very important for sort of maintaining government stability and sort of order in the emerging conflict with Germany. So essentially keeping the British government stable. He is very important to that. So kind of suspicious why he was there around that time when somebody was killed. So he's there. His relatives come into the plot, and he has a sister, no, I guess maybe a sister-in-law technically, who is Julia Oliveira, and then her daughter, Jane Oliveira, is actually like having a secret tryst with Mr. Rakes. So that becomes a big part of the plot. The dentist had an assistant named Gladys who had a very churlish, like, asshole of a fiance named Frank, and both of them are kind of getting into the mix of things. There is a kind of like retired, like, Secret Service type guy who Poirot is consulting with on a few different occasions. And then there is a young couple, Albert Chapman and Sylvia Chapman, who also kind of come into the plot later on in connection with Miss Sainsbury Seal. So those are all the characters, and that's kind of the general plot thing. So like, let's talk about this more broadly. So as I mentioned, in terms of just like my thoughts, I actually really enjoyed this one. This is a book that has a lot of political intrigue in it, and some people don't love that in Agatha Christie. That's something that I personally really enjoy in her books. Notably, we've talked about this before in the book The Big Four, which is definitely one that a lot of people do not enjoy at all, and it's like a personal favorite of mine. I just happen to really like that one. But this book to me feels like a more mature, more fully realized version of The Big Four, because I think it has a lot of the same elements of sort of political intrigue and conspiracy, basically, that is fun in The Big Four, but I think she finds a way to weave that in with a really satisfying novel-length murder mystery. And I do think that this is a particularly well done kind of, it was a very well orchestrated murder story, and I think that I mean, take this with a grain of salt, judge this as you will, but this is one of the few ones in this reread where I could not remember exactly who'd done it, and I couldn't work out just by what I know of Agatha Christie who had done it. I thought I knew, and I had two people, and I was right that it was one of them, but I couldn't totally remember, or I couldn't surmise who it was based on her normal trickery, and then I also couldn't remember who it was because it had been a while. So it may be that I'm just enjoying the fact that I didn't remember what had happened already. So, you know, take that into account with my opinion, but I think that this is actually quite a well done mystery. One of the better ones. She's definitely way better, I feel like, than Sad Cypress. I think that this is leaps and bounds better than that one. But anyway, so I liked this book, and I actually think that this is very typical Christie in a lot of ways. So I think that this could be, if you've never read one before and this premise sounds intriguing to you, this might be a good place to start with Agatha Christie. Getting into some of the, like, cultural, moral stuff that we've been talking about. To me, basically the main thing I just wanted to bring up, aside from a couple of recurring themes, definitely this is a what you see isn't always the truth situation for sure. I think that that's a huge piece of there's a lot of misdirection in this particular one. So that's definitely there. I mentioned in the last one that Agatha Christie starts getting a bee in her bonnet about people being too educated or educated above their station. That comes up several times in this book. There's a cranky Anglo-Indian military guy who's older, who is really suspicious of Hercule Poirot because he's a foreigner. That comes up in this book and the next one. That's definitely a favorite of hers. But anyway, so, you know, there's some of the recurring themes we've talked about again and again. The main thing I wanted to bring up is the fact that this book was written, I believe, in 1939. Either 1939 or 1940. Essentially, by the time this book was written, certainly World War II has started. And in this book, because it is such sort of like, there's a lot of political intrigue happening, you might expect, with that in mind, that there would be a lot about Hitler in this, or a lot about Mussolini or Franco or whoever. And it's interesting because in the opening scene there is like a little discussion between Poirot and Mr. Morley about Hitler and Mussolini, but in general the focus is not on Nazis or fascism, though a couple, like, there's definitely references to that, like, don't get me wrong, and the secretary's fiance Frank is basically made out to be like the English version of a Nazi. Like, that's his deal. He's like such an asshole, guys. Like, God, what a jerk. Everybody keeps telling her to leave him and she won't because the heart wants what it wants, whatever. But anyway, so there is some discussion of Nazis, but I think what is really interesting is that really the kind of bogeyman in this book are the Reds, or communism. And this is something that when I was teaching, like when I was in grad school, I was a teacher's assistant. I had like a section that I taught, and one of the things that we would talk a lot about is it's very easy for us now to look back and be like, dude, why were you guys not more worried about Hitler? Like, really, you should have been pretty worried about this. But a huge part of why people were not that worried, or not as worried as they should have been about Hitler, was because a lot of people saw Germany and that kind of fascist bloc as a buffer between the rest of Europe and Russia, because there's this huge fear of communism. And communism in a lot of ways is seen as more threatening to the social order and a lot more scary, right? This is a huge part, for instance, of the calculus of the Vatican and why they did not denounce fascism more strongly. A lot of reasons, but that is a reason, is that they basically felt like, hey, if I'm picking between fascism and communism, I'm picking fascism. And a lot of people felt that way. And it's interesting in this book because that really, again and again, you do hear references to the Nazis, but it's really there's a lot of agitation happening, and almost all of it, you get the impression, is coming from communism, or communist in Britain. There's this real sense of like kind of a Red Scare happening in a lot of ways. And I don't think that that's necessarily point to point what was actually happening at the time in the UK, but that is definitely kind of the fear that Agatha Christie is playing on. So I think it's well worth noting that even though we are at the beginning of what we now think of as the defining war of the 20th century, there's still more of an emphasis on a lingering suspicion or scare of communism. I also think it's interesting, and I don't want to get too detailed into this because this would start to give away the resolution of the plot, but I do think that Agatha Christie leaves a lot of ambiguity in terms of who is right and who is wrong, like who's good, who's bad, in terms of people's political ideologies and how they then behave in their personal lives. And I think one thing that this book kind of made me reflect on, I'll get personal here real quick, is that, I'm a progressive, right? Like I'm a spot of blue in the South, so I'm a spot of blue in a sea of red. There's a lot of very conservative politics around me, and I can get a little dispirited by that sometimes, and it's hard sometimes to separate what people think from who they are as people. But this was such a reminder to me of why I'm actually really glad. Because there's days where I'm like, fuck this, I should just move to Massachusetts and not have to deal with this. Like, I wish that I was just somewhere where there were more people who were like-minded to me. But actually, I think this reminded me of what a gift it is to be a minority ideology or opinion or whatever. It can be a real blessing in a lot of ways, because when I'm tempted to think, oh, all conservatives are like this, I live and work and am related to and, go to the grocery store with and whatever, alongside people who I think are just flat out wrong. Like, I think that they're just wrong about a lot of things. But because I have to live with them, I cannot fall into the trap of just thinking they are totally bad. Like, that group of people is just bad. And I think that's honestly like one of the biggest problems that we have today in Western society in general, is this idea of the great sort and how people don't have to confront people who disagree with them on a regular basis anymore in real life. They can just do it on the internet. And I think it was a reminder to me that, like, I can never, even when I think somebody is 100% wrong and I want to ascribe really bad motives to why I think they're wrong, it was such a reminder to me, this book, that that you can't do that. That I need to lean into the discomfort of being like, I know you're a really good person who I think is just like big fat red F wrong about this. And leaning into that tension and living with that tension. I think this book just really reminded me of that, because a lot of the people who I was very sympathetic to in terms of their political ideology, I was also very uncomfortable with how they actually interacted with people. And I do think that Agatha Christie is purposely playing on a lot of these tensions, most notably in the character of Jane Oliveira, because she's an heiress, right? Like, she's gonna get a shit ton of money when Alistair Blunt dies, probably, and she's living this very luxurious life, but then she's also in love with this communist, basically, and talking about how, oh, there needs to be a new heaven and a new earth, while she's in this like $2,000 dress. Do you know what I mean? And I think that Agatha Christie is very purposefully sort of creating a lot of tensions between people's ideologies and how they actually conduct themselves. And I think you start to think she's going one place, and then she does have a little bit of a twist and sort of really is even-handed across all the different sort of places where people are coming from. That, you know, that can be true if you're, you know, whether you're super conservative, super progressive, somewhere in the middle, that's all well and good, but a lot of what actually constitutes your goodness or badness is how you treat people on an everyday basis and how you deal with things like the death of somebody insignificant. Because I should say, that's another thing that comes up quite a bit in this book, is this idea of, oh, well, you should just let these go. Like, who cares if Miss Sainsbury Seal is missing? She's like just this random missionary. Like, it doesn't matter. Or who cares if Mr. Morley killed himself or didn't? He's just a dentist. And Hercule Poirot again and again is saying, no, like, it does matter. It actually really does matter that we get justice for everyone, even if maybe they're not that important, and that ultimately is really the arbiter of whether or not you are a good or a bad person. And I think that, again, I think I've talked a little bit about how Christie is very clearly kind of repulsed by this idea of like domestic tyranny, domestic evil, petty tyranny, whatever I've been calling it. And I think Poirot, and actually I think this is the first book where he actually comes out and says this, that he has a very bourgeois sense of morality when it comes to murder. I think a lot of what Agatha Christie is doing in these books is again and again celebrating that very kind of simple and childlike, and in some ways I think it's easy as we get older to be like, well, it's not always black and white, that she really does kind of hold the center of like, yes, things are not always black and white, but at the end of the day, if somebody murders somebody else, like, it doesn't matter what the circumstances were to some degree. Like, we still have to really like reconcile with this, and cold-blooded murder can't be allowed to stand, even if it would maybe be more convenient if we did let it just go. So anyway, little sidetrack on communism, our place as citizens in the world, which is to lean into discomfort and to actually confront people as people and not just as, you know, holders of an ideology. Is sort of where I ended up with this particular Christie book, so do with that what you will. So in terms of where I would rank this isn't like one of my very favorites. I think I gave this a 4 out of 5 on Goodreads, and I feel really comfortable with that rating. But I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was really just solid, a really good place to start with Christie if you are interested in that kind of premise. And yeah, I enjoyed this one, so I would recommend it. So next week we have Evil Under the Sun, which is a really, really good one, like just super good. I had mentioned that I thought we were getting into a little spate of ones that were not that good, and I think we might not be quite there yet. Like, I think I jumped the gun. I thought that Sad Cypress was like when it really went downhill, and I think not quite yet. There's a few really solid ones in the next couple of weeks. So next week is Evil Under the Sun, so tune back in for that. But aside from that, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please do like, subscribe, follow me on the social medias if you are so inclined. I have all that information listed in the description box below, and I will just talk to you guys later. Bye!